It was the summer I was 12. I was out in the woods and I'm walking along. I start hearing these strange sounds. They sounded like bipedal footsteps. And I got this really weird feeling. I am Brian King Sharp. I'm the host of the Sasquatch Odyssey Podcast and other podcasts, but I got into Bigfoot really because it was a childhood thing. I grew up in the North Georgia mountains and I heard stories from people in my family, people around that area that had experienced something that they couldn't explain they called them hairy man, boogers, those kind of things. Sasquatch and Bigfoot wasn't really in the nomenclature there at the time. But I grew up with those stories and I was very interested in cryptids. You know, the Loch Ness Monster was something that always fascinated me. So I grew up with those stories and I had an experience when I was 12 that I believe could have been related to Sasquatch. Now, looking back on it, I think I might have been paced out of the woods and bluff charged by one of these things. So that sort of sparked the interest for me. And, I grew up and started a career in law enforcement. And you don't really talk about cryptids. You don't talk about UFOs. You don't talk about strange things when you're a police officer. So for about 16 years in law enforcement, I sort of suppressed that. I had a UFO experience with my mom when I was 16. We saw a huge craft above us, 800 feet away from us. There was no mistaking that it was something that wasn't supposed to be there. But you don't talk about those things, obviously, as, in your law enforcement career. At least I didn't talk about it. So I kind of suppressed that. And then, later in life, I left law enforcement and took a different career path. And now I podcast full time and do an encounters show where I document Bigfoot encounters. So it's been an interesting ride for sure. But that's really what started the interest for me, was hearing those stories as a kid in the area and then having my own experience when I was 12.
Why don't you tell me in detail the experience you had when you were 12?
I was basically out in the woods. We were very poor when I was growing up, so we didn't own our own place, but we rented a tiny house out in the country area the town I lived in at the time had literally one stop sign. It was very tiny, very low population, rural area. But we had a lot of fields in the area that the guy that owned our house on those fields. So I had carte blanche to go out and just roam this area. And I did that quite often. And I fancied myself a little bit of a squirrel hunter. And I would take my little BB gun, my pellet rifle, whatever I could get my hands on, and go out and hunt birds and squirrels and that kind of thing. And I did that one summer. It was the summer I was 12. So I think school had just got out and I was out in the woods and I'm walking along in an area and I start hearing these strange sounds they sounded like bipedal footsteps. And I got this really weird feeling that if you document enough Sasquatch encounter stories, you hear people talk about. It's that feeling of, for me, it was the hair standing up on the back of my neck, the hair was standing up on my arms, and I just got this feeling of I was frozen. And I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. I felt like it was time for me to be somewhere else, but my feet literally would not work. I was petrified. And then I hear these huffs and these gruffs and these growls and what sounds like a linebacker. It's coming maybe 20 feet away through the underbrush in this thick scrub that I couldn't see through. If anybody's been to North Georgia, I live in North Carolina now. And if you've ever been out in the woods in those areas, you know that, especially in the summertime, you can't see 5 feet in front of you in some places. So this thing was literally just on the outskirts of my field of view. And it sounded just like, in retrospect, I didn't know anything about it then, but when I started doing some research and looking into it, it sounded exactly like what you would imagine a large silverback gorilla charging at somebody through the underbrush in the North Georgia mountains. That's what it sounded like. I didn't stick around after that. I was able to overcome the fear. Something kicked in my lizard brain and fight or flight kicked in, and it became flight at that point. And I turned around and ran the 600 to 800 yards back to the house. I literally jumped over the fence and landed in my yard. And it was kind of like, okay, I'm safe now. And I didn't tell anybody. I went inside. My mom was in the house at the time. I didn't tell anybody what had happened. I didn't know what to tell her. What do you say? She was going to tell me it was probably a cow or it was a deer or it was, so I just kept it to myself. And for the longest time, I don't think I told my mom about that until a couple of years ago, that I'd had that kind of experience. And again, I've never said it's Bigfoot. I never will say it was a Sasquatch because I didn't see what did it. It's just the culmination of the hundreds of stories that I've now documented on my show and the people that I've talked to that have had similar experiences. We either experienced exactly the same thing that was a completely normal animal, or we experienced something that may have been something else, like a Sasquatch. So when I started putting those things in my together in my later years, I say, it could have been. And we were going through a lot of weird stuff in the house. There was like some demonic activity going on. There had been some people who had lived in the house that were doing some demonic seances and things like that going on in the house. And I was experiencing a lot of that as a kid. I was hearing voices in the house, just really weird things. My dad was having experiences that I found out about later where he was hearing and experiencing some of the same things I was experiencing. And later on, I was a guest on a show a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now. I was a guest on another podcast, and the host of that show was into that sort of demonic kind of thing. That was demonology was his specialty, I guess, if that's a thing. And he said to me, interestingly, do you think it could have been something that maybe followed you out of the house, if you believe in that sort of thing at all? Maybe it was this demonic entity that was in the woods that you experienced and not a Sasquatch because you didn't see it. And I was like, well, I'm the kind of guy that I've got to be open minded to that. Again, I can't say definitively what it was. I know something happened. I definitely experienced it. It didn't happen in my mind. It was a real thing that happened to me. I just don't know what it was. So I say it's Sasquatch. Could have been something else. I don't know.
Well, people do talk about entities and beings and such following them home. So I suppose that could happen where you take something out in the woods with you and it does respond. That's interesting because I haven't heard it from that perspective before.
Yeah, that was the first time I'd ever even considered that as an option. I was kind of stunned when he said it to me on the show. I didn't really know how to respond, but my answer was very much like it is now 3 years later. I have to consider that as a possibility because anybody who listens to my show or anybody who has seen me speak at a conference or has met me at a conference, they know I'm very skeptical. I come at this from a very Occam's razor sort of approach. I try to take the most logical explanation for whatever's happening, whether it's my own experiences or the people that I talk to and they share their experiences with me. I sort of filter everything through that same lens. 16 years as a cop, you sort of develop those kind of skills, and it's very difficult to change that. And I was always kind of that sort of person anyway. So the law enforcement training and experience just sort of drilled that home for me. So I'm very skeptical when it comes to anything. And people say to me all the time, well, you're skeptical to a fault, but I do believe that these things exist. I'm just not completely convinced that everybody is experiencing Sasquatch when they have their encounters. So I'm skeptical. I believe that there is a possibility that the majority of the people I talk to have those kind of experiences, and it is with the Sasquatch, but I always leave that little bit of room for doubt. I've had tons of experiences here we have 40 acres here in North Carolina, and we've heard vocalizations, and I have heard strange sounds outside, and I have casted footprints several times on the property that I've found that I believe are probably Sasquatch. There's no other explanation for how they got on my property in the places that they were. I've casted prints on my neighbor's property, 3/4 of a mile away from my house. So but I'm still skeptical about my own evidence, right? I mean, I put it out there for people and I let people take what they want. They leave the rest. I never definitively say that anything I've casted is a Sasquatch footprint, even though it's 15 inches and long and 7.5, 8 inches wide, and it's got 5 toes and it looks like a stereotypical Sasquatch print. But I just never say anything definitively about it because I haven't seen the creature. I haven't seen one. I haven't seen anything obviously leave the footprints that I've casted on the property. So I'm skeptical, but I believe, if that makes any sense. I guess that those things can exist simultaneously.
Well, it's kind of an interesting food for thought that we do give more credibility to a visual sighting as opposed to a vocalization because we can see it. And then we give even more credibility when there's a print or a footprint because that's something real physical evidence of something. But if you look at poltergeist types of experiences, they can be, I mean, or demonic. I don't really call things demonic, but haunting kind of experiences. We can have vocalizations. We can hear something. We can see something, as well as things can move around, or there can be some physical activity. But I hadn't really associated that with these various types of Bigfoot evidence.
Yeah, and the one thing that's happened to me recently, I went up to Radium, BC, Canada, and I went out on a week-long expedition with controversial figure Todd Standing. He's somebody I've talked about on the show many times, and I've called him out for hoaxing his videos, and it is what it is. Our relationship is what it is. But I finally broke down and went up there in October of this year. I was up there the first week of October, and we had a ton of experiences that I can't explain. We had rocks thrown at us. I heard vocalizations. I believe on a couple of occasions I interacted with what I believe to be a Sasquatch doing wood knocks. And I can't explain that any other way. And I brought that back and I just put it out there, for people to digest. I've put probably 8 or 10 hours worth of audio that I recorded out so far with us talking around the campfire. You hear these things happening. You can literally hear the rocks hitting this camper that was 20 feet behind us. And there's nobody else out there. So I tend to, even those experiences that I was there for, I go back and I say, is it possible there was a person out there? Well, no, there's nothing out there but thousands of acres of woods around us. We are literally in the middle of nowhere. We were 18 miles back off of a logging road. There's nobody back there throwing rocks at the camper. The people that were sitting around the campfire when I was recording the audio and talking to these people were the only ones within at least 18 miles that I know of. So, but it's interesting that you say that, because I do that in my own show and the people that I talk to. I started my show specifically to document encounters with Bigfoot. I wanted to talk to people who had seen these things, and I wanted to gather as much data, particularly in the southeastern United States where I am born and raised and still live. Because when I was a kid, like most people, you hear about Sasquatch possibly being out in the Pacific Northwest in California, Bluff Creek, where the Patterson-Gimlin film was filmed, but never on the East Coast. I've even had conversations with the late Peter Byrne. I think I was the last person to do a podcast interview with Peter Byrne, one of the four horsemen of Sasquatchery. And Peter and I disagreed about that because he didn't believe that Sasquatch has or ever existed like east of the Rockies, right? So I wanted to document as much of that as I could. In a way, I guess it was my way of trying to overreach and validate my own experiences in some way. I want to talk to other people that live in this area so I can say, yeah, if that happened to them, then it possibly happened to me. And the more people that I talked to, they were having experiences, and anecdotal accounts are what they are. I've had some really wild stories on the show that people have had tons of experiences. You meet those people and you interview people who have had multiple encounters. Literally, some people have claimed 10, 20 encounters with these things where some wild things are happening during their experiences. But if there is physical evidence, that's one of the things I always ask for, is a photograph. If you have a habituation situation and you're interacting with this clan of Sasquatch that you've been interacting with for 20 years, then there should be some evidence there. There should be a way that you can take a photograph or a video, or there's audio of you interacting with the vocalizations that they're having. Some people claim to talk to these things. And I found the disappointing thing for me in a lot of these cases is it seems the more out there they are, the more wild the encounters, the more multiple times they're interacting with them, the less evidence is out there. It tends to be interviews like I've done over just the last couple of weeks. It's a haphazard encounter. You're on the bank fishing, or you're in your boat fishing, and you see this thing walk across the bank, and you walk over there, or you take your boat over there, and there's a footprint left behind. So the physical evidence certainly adds that other level of credibility to me, but there's not a lot of it there. I just finished the manuscript for my book. I just finished this past week, and I devoted an entire chapter to evidence. What evidence is out there? What constitutes evidence? I think that's a lot of what I've run into with skeptical people in the Bigfoot community is they say that anecdotal experiences aren't evidence, but they are. Eyewitness testimony in a court of law convicts people all the time. And I even did a chapter, I literally said, I think I named the chapter, Can We Convict Sasquatch in a Court of Law? Let me lay out the case for you and see what you think. If you're on the jury, can we convict Sasquatch of being real? And I try to lay out that evidence. And a lot of that is physical evidence, but the majority of it is anecdotal. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. There are thousands of anecdotal accounts of these things throughout history, and that's what my entire show is about. There are other podcasts out there who have thousands of episodes of people sharing their encounters. So I think we have to take that in account. And I certainly do. I put a lot of weight behind the people who come on and share their stories. You know, some of them are fantastical and some of them are just mundane things that they're doing in the woods like I was doing, and they have an experience like that. So I don't know. I think I went on a tangent there. I think I answered your question and then went way beyond that. So.
Well, I have to agree with you. And I haven't been at this probably as long as you have, but in all of the interviews I've done, I can't imagine all of these people just making this up. They seem credible, believable, and there's an emotional element to some of their experiences that just really, really lay it out as a truthful experience for them anyway.
Yeah, I think that's what it really boils down to for me on my show. I've wrestled with some of the episodes that I've put out with some really wild stories that people have told me because they are so fantastical. And I have come to the conclusion that eventually I will put some of those out that I've held on to for months in some cases because they are so fantastical. But at the end of the day, everybody's experience is their experience, right? Who am I to say that you didn't have the experience that you had? So I try to approach that from that point of view. Do I believe everything that everybody tells me on the show? No, I don't. Memory is certainly fallible. There's, time passes. Are people remembering things? Do I remember my own experience exactly how it happened when I was 12 years old? I'll be 49 in December. That happened a long time ago. So, do I get some of the details wrong? Did I feel exactly what I felt then, or is that something that's been imposed as I've gathered information over the years? That's another thing I talk about in the book is Bigfoot in the pop culture zeitgeist. We're constantly inundated with people's stories, and there's a there I go into the psychological reasons and how that affects people when you're constantly being immersed in that sort of community. And I think a lot of that happens. I think there's sort of Bigfoot contagion that can happen. I don't believe in the mass hallucinations. That's something else I sort of address in the book because a lot of skeptical people think that Bigfoot is just some big mass hallucination that literally everybody who says they have a Sasquatch sighting is hallucinating the exact same thing with people they've never met, hundreds of miles away, decades apart. I don't buy into that. But I think there is something to people being inundated with Bigfoot stuff all the time. And podcasts are one of those things that do that. My show contributes to that in a lot of ways. Finding Bigfoot, Expedition Bigfoot, all the shows that you can hear and watch and be a part of sort of exposes people to that. And I think in some way people want to be involved in that. I say it a lot on the show. I've met so many fantastic people that I now call friends that I would have never met had it not been for Bigfoot or the subject of Bigfoot. It's a community. Sometimes we eat our own. Sometimes the community is not great, but it's just like any other community that you get involved in. But I think a lot of people want to be a part of that in some way. And for a lot of people, it becomes the experiences. And I think that's why a lot of people, some people make up their experiences, I think. I think we have to be intellectually honest as researchers and people that are investigating this and really want to find answers to the phenomenon. I think we have to be honest about all the possible aspects of it. There's certainly mental health stuff out there. I address that some in the book as well and talk a little bit about some of the mental health stuff that goes on. We have to realize and understand that evidence is hoaxed. I mean, that's a huge thing nowadays with the artificial intelligence and the people are creating. It's very difficult to really vet some of these deep fakes that people are creating. And it's just making it really difficult for people like I consider myself a serious researcher or investigator and really trying to get to answers in the subject. it just, all of those layers makes it very difficult. Anytime somebody makes up a story about an encounter or creates a hoax or whether it be a video or even if it's, something like what was the train video that came out a couple of months back, people started sending that to me, and immediately I said, that's clearly a man in a suit, my opinion, of course. And then it eventually came out as it was, a hoaxed video that whoever made the suit or whatever had put out to drum up whatever they were trying to drum up for people to buy the suits. But I think that kind of stuff sets us back so far when we're really trying to get answers, because there's a lot of evidence out there. I've talked to people I know. I've talked to Cliff Barrickman. Cliff's a friend of mine, and I know that he runs the North American Bigfoot Center in Boring, Oregon, and people have brought trail cam videos and things on their phone to Cliff, and he's like, "Holy smokes, that is a clear image of a Sasquatch that people will never see, because there is so much of the negative aspect to bringing evidence forward, and people just don't want to be involved in that." So, unfortunately, I think there's a lot of that that's out there that we'll never see because of some of the hoax and the fakery and the other things that go on in the Bigfoot community.
That's true. There's a lot of it there. And I also saw the train video, and I'm like you. I felt like it was obvious that it wasn't a real thing. And it is unfortunate that we don't get to see the ones that are better or clearer or maybe more obvious that they are real, because those, I think, would be more credible. Also, something else you touched on, I think it is more popular. It's kind of a trendy subject right now, because of all the shows, the podcasts, and everyone's jumping on board, the conferences, everything is just kind of coming forward with it. Not that I mind that. It's a good trendy subject, perhaps, but I think that opens the door for a lot of people to jump on board and hoax things and bring it forth non-credible evidence sometimes, because they want to be part of that trend as well.
Yeah, it's definitely exactly like you said. I think a lot of people are looking to capitalize on it. And that's a touchy subject that I deal with often, because I started my podcast. Sasquatch Odyssey started in February of 2021. By March of 2021, I'd left my full-time job as a retail manager. I was running a super hub for a auto parts manufacturer here in North Carolina, and I left that to do this full time. So I make money off of my podcast. It is my full-time job. And there is a sort of a disconnect with a lot of people in the community that, and I'm sure you've even dealt with that. If you monetize your YouTube channel, there's a lot of people in the community who look down on you and say you're taking advantage of Bigfoot and you're exploiting the subject. And it's the complete opposite for me. Anybody who knows me or has been on my show or has had anything to do with me knows how passionate I am about the subject and wanting to find answers for myself, and then just for everybody else. If I have something I know about the subject or can share, that's one of the reasons I just finished the book, is to be able to share my little bit of nuggets of what I've learned from interviewing probably 500 plus people at this point for the show, and putting that out there in the zeitgeist for maybe people to learn from. But just the back and forth in the community, a lot of times, that's why I said earlier, we kind of eat our own in a way, because people will look down on you if you write a book, you're trying to exploit the subject, or if you do a Bigfoot show documentary and you get paid for it, you're exploiting the subject. It's the complete opposite for me. I love my job. I do something that I wake up every day, and I can't wait to start working on the show because it's the best thing that I've ever done. And I have the best of both worlds, because I can work in a subject that I'm passionate about and I can pay the bills at the same time. So again, it's one of those things, but you do have nefarious people out there who are doing things that are just wanting to capitalize and, go viral and make a, 10,000 bucks or whatever over the course of a week with a hoax or whatever their motivation is. But it's as the subject, it's sort of a double-edged sword, because as the subject continues to grow in popularity, you're going to have those people that look at that and say, how can I get a piece of the pie? And then that's when you get those folks that come in and do the major hoaxes. And again, I have a chapter dedicated to known hoaxes in the Bigfoot community. But then there is a lot of evidence out there that people are still debating. So the clear videos, Todd Standing's one of those people that has clear HD quality video that, you're either in one camp or the other. I say it's fake. For every person who say they're fake, there's 10 other people who say it's absolutely genuine and legit. But we're still talking and debating the Patterson Gimlin film from 1967. We're still talking about and debating whether the Sierra sounds are legitimate. And I've talked to Ron plenty of times. I think they are, you know, and he has hours of stuff that people have never heard, and we may never hear it. I don't think Ron really knows what to do with it, but it's out there. He has it. And I wish that we could dive into that and maybe take a look at some of the things that people have never heard and maybe learn even more from it, because everybody's used to that. Yeah, you can look on YouTube and do the Sierra sounds, you get like 4 minutes, right? There's tons more. There's literally hours of the stuff that nobody has ever heard. Well, a few people have heard, but it's things like that. It's really difficult to even look at the evidence. Again, it goes back to whether it's fake or not, AI, these hoaxes. I don't know. I wish the people that have evidence that haven't put it out there for people would go through some channels and put out some of the trail cam videos, some of the trail cam photos that I know are out there. I think there's some smoking guns out there, but I just don't know that we'll ever see it because of the saturation of hoaxes and just the debate. Again, I've taken some foot castings recently on the property, maybe 2 months ago, and I haven't put out any photos of them and may not because they turned out so good. They look like some of the best print cast that you'll ever see. And when people see those, they automatically assume that it's a hoax. I've had that conversation with Cliff. I was on Cliff and Bubbo's show a couple of months back. And that's one of the things Cliff and I talked about on the show was saying, if you're casting everything you're finding, most of your casts are going to look like crap. And most of mine do. I probably got 4 sets of cast and 3 of them look like crap. And then this one set, because of whatever this was, where it stepped, I got 4-inch impressions and I was able to pour the plaster perfectly, got great casts. But I'm not going to put it out there, at least not now, because the first thing people say is it's a hoax. And I just don't feel like dealing with that. I don't have time to deal with that, really, because I know it's not a hoax and I have the evidence here, but I'd like to share it with other people. But then you get into that. Like I said, Bob Gimlin's been dealing with that since 1967. Ron Moorhead has been dealing with that since the 70s when they captured the Sierra Sound. So, I think it's going to be something that continues to happen in Bigfoot. I think it's going to take a body. I think somebody's going to have to bring one of these things in. I don't certainly advocate shooting or killing anything, but I think that's ultimately what it's going to take. DNA is something that's, really out there in the zeitgeist at this point. Darby Orcutt is doing his study up here in my home state at UNC Chapel Hill, I believe. And I've talked to Darby about that. It's interesting to me. I just had a kid on from the UK last week. He's 14 years old, little cryptozoologist named Daniel doing his thing over in the UK. And he picked up some eDNA in a footprint casting that he did, sent it off, and it came back with old world monkey DNA and great ape DNA. And we literally just had a meeting about it on Zoom a couple of days ago, having the conversation about what does that mean? What's the next step? Is DNA the thing that's going to solve this? I personally don't think so. Doug Hychek is working on Legend Meat Science too. I'm supposed to be doing an interview for that in the next couple of weeks. So, I know they're testing a lot of DNA during that, and they're going to have hopefully some interesting results. I don't know how, Linda, you've been in this now. You've talked to a lot of people. What do you think about DNA? Do you think DNA is going to get it done, or do you think it's going to take a body? What do you see solving the mystery that we're all so interested in?
I think, of course, the body obviously would be the ultimate thing, but I think that's going to be a hard thing to do. The DNA, I think if there are enough samples cross country or maybe even worldly, that can begin to show some similarities, and you have some credible people collecting it, there might be some. I don't know that it's going to be enough evidence to convince the powers that be that the Bigfoot actually exists. But I think it's good enough for us to say, okay, this is something that we can begin to use as a standard. And right now we don't have DNA standard to be able to really judge other DNA samples by.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that's one of the conversations I had. I have not had Darby Orcutt on the show. I actually talked to him when I was at a conference a couple of months back in the summer. And that's one of the things that I really wanted to get into with him. I've had the conversation since about, I was under the impression that you had to have something to compare it to, but DNA has evolved and advanced to the point where they can sequence with a very, very small amount of DNA, even eDNA to some extent, they can do this with. So I'm excited about the DNA thing. I just think it's going to be very difficult because, again, you get into a lot of issues. We've had some infamous DNA studies in the past, 10, 12 years ago that did not turn out so well. And I think a lot of people are sort of gun shy when it comes to that. And then there's questionable, tactics with getting the samples. There's a ton of stuff that you have to go through to collect samples, and it's not as simple and as easy as a lot of people think it is. But I think that it's great that citizen scientists are out there doing things in the woods and trying to at least capture something, whether it be hair or maybe some skin cells or something left behind. I don't know. I think it's great that people are out there doing that. I don't think it's going to be enough. I think somebody is going to have to either bring one of these things in or do a long term. That's one of the things I talked to some folks at the North American Wood Ape Conservancy out at Area X recently. I had a couple of those guys back to back on the show, and Daryl Collier and some of them have talked about their mission, or part of their mission has always been to collect a specimen. And they continue to do that to this day. Yet they're transitioning, at least Daryl was. He doesn't take a rifle out anymore. He's got a really good camera set up, and he's really trying to get HD quality video of these creatures. And he really feels like if they do that over a long period of time and establish enough, like literally get videos of individuals that are distinct, and you're able to say, okay, that's Sally or whoever that is over the course of weeks or months or even years, that may be enough evidence for some people that at least they're in that area and it is a Sasquatch. Again, I don't know. I think it's cool that people are doing that kind of stuff and that at least they're trying. But I'm at the point where I really want to know definitively that these things are real, that maybe what I experienced when I was 12 was a Sasquatch. And then it would be great to know that all the people that I'm talking to on the show are having these experiences with an undocumented relic hominoid of some sort that's walking around in North America. I don't know. It's a fascinating subject. That's what keeps me coming back. I love talking to people about it. I love meeting, like I said, I've met lifelong friends because of Bigfoot, and I meet interesting people every single day as a part of my job, as do you. I'm sure you do these interviews
Yes.
just like I do. So
Yes, lots of fascinating interviews, and I learned something from every one of them. One of the thoughts, and this surprised me when I began doing the interviews. It in my mind, it was just strictly a flesh and blood creature out here in the woods, and didn't really know a great deal about Bigfoot at all. It was surprising to me when I started hearing things about them being part of maybe the fairy world, or they were coming through portals or turning into orbs of light. I just found that a very fantastic way of looking at Bigfoot. And that, of course, complicates the whole subject matter if there's something odd about Bigfoot in that nature, because the flesh and blood characteristics may be very difficult to define.
yeah, I agree. I was going back and remastering an old episode because I'd had a guy on like episode 9 of my show. It was in early like March of 2021 when I did his first interview. And I was remastering that audio and putting it out because I just had Mike back on. His show's going to air as we record this. It's going to be in a couple of days on Friday. His show's going to air because he's had other experiences since then in the couple of years it's been since I interviewed him the first time. So he came back to talk about those. So I thought it would be cool to go back and remaster that and clip that back out for the folks that may have not heard it back when I was doing the first 10 episodes of the show. And we talked about that. We got into the orb thing, and it was a common thing. It seems more, or it seems like it was more common back then than it is today. But there are some really strange experiences people have with the orbs and the lights and seeing what could be alien craft, possibly before, during, and after, in some cases, a Sasquatch experience. That's one of the things I talked to Stan Gordon. Stan's a pretty prolific UFO and Bigfoot investigator from Pennsylvania. If you've ever seen a UFO documentary on Kecksburg or anything like that, I'm sure you've seen Stan Gordon or heard him talk about the subject. I had Stan on the show a couple of years ago. And it's one of the things we got into, that big flap in like 73 to 74 in that area, where people were having these weird experiences with UFOs and Sasquatch, sometimes at the same time. Literally, they're seeing craft look like they're landing in the fields, and they're having these Bigfoot like, Sasquatch like creatures on the property almost simultaneously in a lot of cases. And I used to completely separate the two. I used to say, oh, well, that's weird. And I would stick to the Bigfoot thing. Or I would say, oh, that's weird that you saw those lights and then you're having these wood knocks and then you see the Sasquatch. But they've got to be mutually exclusive. I don't think they had anything to do with each other. It's just weird that you're having all these experiences on your property. And it tended to be more, again, with some of the people that weren't necessarily having habituation situations, like a Janice Carter, 50 years with Bigfoot kind of thing, or maybe even an Area X would be considered a habituation site where these things are constantly there and you're constantly having interactions with them. But it tended to be more so like a gentleman I talked to in North Carolina who lived around the Uwharrie National Forest, who had these things on his property all the time, in his words. He was seeing them, his kids were seeing them, his wife was seeing them, to the point where they were ready to move. And I've documented other cases like that. So they weren't habituating them, but they were there a lot. And it seemed like those cases were the ones that seemed to have some of the weirder things going on in conjunction with, or at least in and around the sightings or before. I asked the people, I'd say to Bobby, hey, man, when are the lights happening? Are you seeing those more with the Bigfoot stuff? Explain that. His answer was, we don't see the lights and we don't see what looked like the craft if we're not having Sasquatch activity. It's kind of hard to separate that at that point. So it's very difficult for me. Again, I've had a UFO experience. I saw it when I was 16. I believe that they exist. But do I think they have anything to do with Bigfoot? That's kind of a leap for me. And it sounds strange and almost it's kind of hypocritical to say, I guess. I believe in Bigfoot and I believe in aliens. I just don't believe that they could commingle. Who knows? Maybe they do. Maybe there's more to it than I know. But I think the woo part of it, and that's another thing I address in the book, I don't exclude that on my show. I don't exclude people's experiences, no matter how woo or high strangeness it may be. It is your experience, and I listen, I take it all in. But I think the woo for Bigfoot or the high strangeness in Bigfoot, at some point, we have to separate that for it to be taken seriously in the scientific community. Because I've had conversations with Jeff Meldrum. You can't have a woo conversation with Jeff. He's not going to talk about that because he's a scientist. And other scientists are the same way. If they think these things exist, and if a scientist is willing to take a look at the Bigfoot subject at all, they're going to approach it from a very flesh and blood, scientific, it's got to be some sort of a relic hominoid. It's got to be an ape of some sort. So I think we can have that commingle, at least for investigators like me or people who research this or are into the subject. You can take all of that stuff, even mix it together sometimes. But I think in order for it to be taken seriously and us to get real science behind it, I think you have to separate the two at some point. And a lot of people have a hard time doing that. And I think that's one of the reasons that some people have a hard time taking it seriously, because it's the old joke. I grew up with the National Enquirer when I'd go through the supermarket, and I remember seeing, pictures of Bigfoot with a UFO on top with a light coming down. I mean, people wear those t-shirts all the time. We have a t-shirt through our store who has that. It's that very image. It's almost become a cliche and a joke to talk about that. But I think if you take the subject seriously, you have to look at it. You can't have a conversation. I know you've had conversations with Ron Moorhead. You can't have a conversation with a person like Ron and not get into that, because he believes there's a whole lot more to everything than what we believe or what we know. So I think you have to be open to it, but I think at some point you have to separate the wheat from the chaff and just say, the high strangeness is something people are experiencing, but we have to look at this from a flesh and blood point of view to really get science involved and maybe to push the ball down the field as far as the research is concerned.
Well, I have to agree. I think with science, it's going to have to be something that they, within their scientific realm, that they can actually put into a pattern or a test form where they can actually get some evidence. However, if Sasquatch doesn't fit into our scientific knowledgeable realm at this point, we may never get any evidence. So we also, I think, have to scientifically take our science into a place that we may never have been before, if by chance there is something there that's not known.
Yeah, I definitely think you're correct. I definitely, that's why I keep my mind open to any of the high strangeness. I spend time in the woods with somebody like Todd Standing and his research partner and life partner, Ashley, and they believe they mind speak with Bigfoot. They think they have a telepathic communication with Sasquatch. I've interviewed people like Les Stroud, Survivor Man, and he has had a couple of experiences where he believes that he's had a telepathic communication with a Sasquatch in the woods. I don't know what you do with that. I've never had that experience. I've been around people when they claim to have had those experiences in real time. And again, I'm not saying that that's not your experience. I'm not trying to negate your experience. It's just difficult for someone like me and most people, if we're being honest, to wrap your brain around that. But I think that has taught me you have to do that in this kind of research. I have to be open minded enough to say there is a possibility, because what do I know? Sasquatch could totally be telepathic. They could be shapeshifters. They could cloak. They could do all the things that people have claimed to see them do. Again, I say it often, it only takes one person to have that experience and it be real, because anecdotal experiences, I've put them into categories for me. It helps me compartmentalize it. It helps me sort of keep it together when I'm doing all these interviews. And I think it comes down to simple human nature. I think it's like this for most people's stories and most things that people share with other people. Everything they tell you is 100% real. They experienced it exactly like they said they did, and it really happened the way that they said, and they saw what they saw. If that's the case, then that means Sasquatch is 100% real, and everybody who has those kind of experiences did see a Sasquatch, case closed. Then I think there are other people that have misidentifications. I think they probably experience exactly what they say they experience, like me. I experienced something in the woods I can't explain. That was very scary to me, and I will never forget it. It literally changed my life, but I didn't see what it was. So it could have been anything. Doesn't necessarily mean it's Sasquatch, but I had that experience. Then you have people who make up their stories. Just 100% whole cloth. They make it up from beginning to end. Nothing they say happened. They're doing it for attention, whatever their reasoning. They just make it up completely. Or you have those people who it happens in their mind. I think we've all probably had those conversations with people. I know as a police officer, I went on many 911 calls and people had experiences where they were having some sort of a mental breakdown or they were having some sort of mental health issues. And they completely believed that they were being chased by people in their home when the doors were locked and they were the only people there. But that really was happening in their mind. They didn't make anything up. It was real to them as it could possibly be. It was just some sort of a mental health issue. And then I think you have that category it could be a combination of all of those things, right? So it's a lot to sift through, especially for people who do interviews and document the way that I do. It's difficult to sift through it, but I think you just keep an open mind and talk to as many people. But it only takes one of those stories, no matter what it is. If one of those stories is true, and those persons that tells that story, whoever that might be, he or she, if they really had that experience, then Sasquatch are 100% real. And that opens the door to maybe everybody who has an experience and shares it experienced exactly what they said. And if that's the case, some of those fantastical stories with the orbs and the lights and even seeing Bigfoot come out of craft, go on to and off of what looks to be extraterrestrial craft, all those stories could be true at the same time. I don't know.
It's
It's
difficult to
fascinating.
know. And since I haven't had any experience with Bigfoot at all, you just have to take people's word for it, and you always have to put that in some corner of your mind that you're not sure. It's their experience, not mine. But I think for any of us, before we can concretely say that we honestly believe in something. We do often have to have an experience with it or have enough confidence in that it is a general consensus of people that this is a true thing. We're not there yet with Bigfoot. Most of the people I talk to, not on interviews, but most of the people I just talk to in the general public have no concept that Bigfoot exists and presume that it's just kind of a joke. It's not really real. Then I start interviewing people on the show, and I realize that they're very, very sincere. And I don't believe you're making up your story. I believe you heard something, and I believe people see something. And even the unusual stories of lights and orbs. I mean, definitely people see orbs. I mean, that's just straight across the board, whether it's a Bigfoot related orb or not. People do see these things out in the woods, especially. It seems like there's a lot of that type of light phenomena that's happening, may or may not be related to Bigfoot whatsoever. I'm not sure about that. But I've never seen an orb either. So, but I do believe they exist. And I believe that there's probably some flesh and blood creature out there that's like a Bigfoot, because I've just interviewed too many people. And so have you, I'm presuming.
Yeah, that's exactly where I come down. I literally, when I finished the book, that was one of the last portions of the book is the truth behind the legend. And what does that mean? I don't think anybody really knows what the truth is. And that's kind of where I came down when I was finishing out the manuscript, was to say the truth really lies in all of us. It's really you taking a look at everything that's out there, whether it's the Patterson Gimlin film, the Freeman footage, any and every foot cast that's ever been taken. You read the books, you watch the documentaries, you listen to shows like mine, you watch shows like yours. You just take all the evidence in, and then you just have to make a decision. And for me, that's been very difficult because I've always wanted to believe. I still want to believe. And although I do believe, like you, there probably is something out there that's very similar to what people have said that they see, I'm just not 100% there because I want to have that experience. I want to be able to say, I've seen it with my own eyes. And therefore, I know it's cliche to say, but I'm a knower, right? I'm not a believer, I'm a knower. That's what people say all the time. Once you have that experience, you just know. So I think that's what it really boils down to for me. The truth behind Sasquatch is in each individual. There's plenty of people who always think it's a joke and it's just something to laugh about. And, you make fun of your buddies who say they saw it when they were out hunting or whatever the case may be. But there are a lot of people. I think the last survey I saw, that legitimate survey, like 1 out of every 3 people in the United States believe that there's something to Bigfoot. It's possible that Sasquatch exists. So that's a lot of people, right? So I don't know. It's an intriguing thing. I will definitely keep coming back and keep doing the show and keep talking to people. It grows every single day. I meet so many more people that have had experiences, and it's my favorite thing to do, honestly, is to talk to people about their experiences. And like I said, just meet wonderful people like you. I would have never met and talked to you had it not been for this subject. And so many people that I now call friends that came because of this subject. And if that's all that comes out of it for me, I will be content with that and I'm happy with that. And I think it's that way for a lot of people. It's a being a part of a community that's like-minded enough to look into a subject that maybe people think is taboo, or they think you're crazy for looking into it. So what? You know, there's no harm in camaraderie and really looking into a subject that fascinates us all, really.
It does. And, it's the mystery of it all and not having all of the facts behind it that keeps us all looking, I think.
I definitely agree.
Well, what else can you tell me? Obviously, you've had a lot more experience in this field than I've had. What are some of the more interesting stories that you know about people's experiences?
I think some of the most interesting stories that I have personally documented are some of the habituation situations that people have. I think that's one of the most fascinating things to me about the subject is there's so many people that have looked into it for decades. Peter Byrne comes to mind. He was one of those people that was out in the field for 60 years. I don't think Peter ever even found a footprint. Very similar to Renee DeHenden and some of the other people that have looked into the subject for so long. Yet you have people in the subject who go out and regularly interact with these things or have tons of sightings. So that's a interesting thing for me. I've documented some of those over the course of the 400 episodes or so of the show at this point. One of the most interesting that I think over the past year was a hunter who was hunting for elk with his dad. I think they were out in Washington State. And it was a very long, drawn out story, but the very short version of it was he and his dad were out. They both had a tag for an elk. They went in separate directions to go hunt during the day. They'd separate from camp. He went to his area. His dad went to his area. This guy started hearing wood knocks, and he would walk. And as he would stop to listen, he was like walking in the direction the wood knocks were coming from. When he would stop, the wood knocks would start up again. He would walk, no wood knocks, but when he would stop, they would happen again. This went on for almost an hour, and he's going into this area. And eventually it culminated with this huge Sasquatch stepping out from behind a tree about 20, 25 feet away from him. And we're in this standoff. He hesitated. He thought about shooting it, but he said, I mean, he clearly said on the show, the gun I had was big enough to take down an elk, but I was not satisfied that I should be pointing it at this thing. So I backed out of there. I was able to get away. And the funny thing about I mean, it's an interesting story, obviously, but it doesn't seem that compelling. What was so compelling to me about his story was twofold. He didn't tell his dad about his experience. That was day one of a 10-day hunt. And for the next 8 or 9 days, he was supposed to be leaving camp and going out hunting. He would leave camp with his dad, and then he would go sit in the truck because he was petrified to go back into the woods, but he didn't tell his dad about his experience. And he was so conflicted and upset with himself because he didn't tell his dad that this thing was out there. And he was possibly putting his dad in harm's way, because the other compelling part about his story is, and I'd never heard anybody say this before or since, he felt like, and it's of course subjective, he has no way to prove this, but it is his experience and his feeling. He felt like this thing was luring him in for some nefarious reason with these wood knocks, because when he was walking in the direction of the creature, nothing was happening. But if he stopped, like he wasn't going to continue on towards the creature, the wood knock started again. So again, he can't prove that. I can't prove that. But I thought it was a very compelling thing that he felt that this thing was luring him in for some nefarious reason. Fortunately for him, that didn't happen and he got away. But he really struggled with his experience, to the point of they left the hunt. He went back home. He started drinking heavily, like to drown his experience, because he thought it was crazy. And he had to go through a lot to give up the alcohol. And he eventually told his dad. He sort of came clean with his dad and had a really emotional moment with his dad and said, I am sorry because I should have told you, but I didn't know how to have that conversation. And I'm looking at this guy in the eyes, and that's one of those compelling things about what we do and documenting encounters. I have a pretty good BS meter, right? I know when somebody's BSing me. I don't think this guy was BSing me at all. And for him to have the emotional response and to have almost lost his wife and his family because of this experience was very compelling to me. Now, it may not be any more compelling than other stories. People enjoy encounter stories for whatever reason. But to me, that was very compelling because, again, it's like you said earlier, the emotional connection that people have. And he had no reason to tell me this story. He had no reason to lie about this story. But he had that experience. He failed to tell his dad. He had this regret. He was having all this remorse about putting his dad in harm's way. And then he was also dealing with the fact that he saw something that wasn't supposed to exist. That's a lot going on for a fairly young dude. So I don't know. It's just one of those that stuck out to me. And then there's, of course, some of the fantastical stories. Again, the stories like the 50 years with Bigfoot, the Janice Carter story. I've talked about that. We've done shows about it a couple of times on the podcast. I have a difficult time with some of those stories because, again, I need evidence. It's kind of I don't know if it's different for me if somebody's having an experience like that. You walk up on something in the woods and you're petrified and you're scared and you take off running. I don't expect this guy to have a cell phone video of this Sasquatch. I don't necessarily expect him to take a photograph of it or to go back and look for physical evidence. But when somebody's saying, I've spent 50 years with these things, and there's literally nothing but a couple of blurry pictures and just some anecdote, I have a difficult time. I think they're fascinating. Those stories are definitely cool to listen to and hear. But I think Carl Sagan said it best: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And when that's not there, I tend to go the opposite direction. But his story was definitely compelling to me for those reasons I shared with you.
Well, I think when it impacts a person's life heavily, and oftentimes that's the case, either it creates a fear factor and they can't go back into the woods and they're no longer hiking and camping and fishing and things that they would normally do. Or the opposite of that is they become obsessed to find Bigfoot and prove that it does exist. So those are kind of two opposing responses, but often the case, that's what I find in people.
Yeah, and that was exactly what happened with him. He came on my show. He had reached out to another podcaster shortly after he had his experience, and they sort of talked off air, and he did help him a lot, sort of reconcile what he had seen, sort of reinforce the fact that he wasn't crazy, that a lot of people had these kind of encounters, because this guy wasn't into Bigfoot. He didn't know anything about Bigfoot until he saw one. And he started listening to my show as a result of that. And he reached out to me and said he was the complete opposite. And I say that often, just like you said, there's one of two things happens. You have that experience, and it does, for me, I wanted to go down the rabbit hole. I wanted to know everything I could possibly know. A lot of people follow that path. This guy was the complete opposite. He said, I don't want to have anything to do with Bigfoot. I'm not going out looking for him. I don't hunt much anymore because of it. But I want to tell my story one time from beginning to end to you, and I want to be done. It's sort of that cathartic moment he needed to have for himself to say, I can now leave this where it needs to be in the past. And I thought that was, again, that was one of those compelling things. He wasn't looking for his 15 minutes of fame. It wasn't something that he was looking for any other reason other than to unburden himself, because he'd never told his story outside of bits and pieces. He'd never told it from beginning to end all the way through. He did that one time on my show and he was done. And I think that's, again, there's nothing wrong with either way. I don't put any more credibility towards the way I handle my potential encounter, or other people who have encounters and they go down the rabbit hole and search for answers for the rest of their life. And same thing for the other people who go the opposite direction. I think they're equally as important to the people who experience that. I'm glad that people are looking into it. I think that if there weren't more people looking into it, we wouldn't be as far down the road as we are. I just don't think there's enough. I think that's part of the reason with the research that people think, oh my God, there's so many people. Why can't we find Bigfoot? Why haven't we found a body? Why can't we get a better picture? There's tons of people out there looking for them. No, not really. If you really think about it and you do the math, I've done this with Dr. Russ Jones before. Russ is pretty prolific. He's an author. He's a researcher, and he does a podcast over on the Untold Radio Network with a bunch of other podcasters like myself. But Dr. Russ Jones is out in the woods constantly. He's a practicing chiropractic doctor. He's been doing his practice for 20 plus years, and he has to work. But when he's not working, he probably spends 120 days a year or so in the woods, which sounds like a lot. I live in the woods, so I spend 365 days in the year in the woods, but I'm not out actively researching. He's out actively researching 120 plus days a year, which is a lot. There's probably maybe, and this is completely my opinion. It's subjective. I don't have anything to back this up statistically. I'm estimating, because I think Russ and I estimated together, there may be 150 people, maybe 150, top end 200 people across the continental United States that spend as much time in the woods as Dr. Russ Jones does looking for Bigfoot. Now, if you break down the square mileage or the acreage in the continental United States where these things could be, and you spread out 200 people, say it's 2,000 people, say it's 20,000 people spending 120 days in the woods. If you really extrapolate it out, do the math, it would be like finding a needle in a stack of needles to find these things if you're actively looking for them. So that's part of the problem with the research, is we need more people looking into it, whether they're documenting encounters like we do on a podcast, or you're actively out in the woods. So anybody
Well,
who's into the subject at all can do their part by doing something.
I did an interview this week with someone talking about thermal drones doing a lot of that work for you, trying to find things. But that's costly, and also you just have to have a lot of monitoring of that and a lot of territory and a lot of permission to fly those drones too.
I can tell you,
But
I got some experience when I was in Canada with Todd Standing. He has a $10,000 thermal drone. We put it up two times while I was there on two different days. We had the right conditions. It was fairly early in the morning. The conditions have to be right. And it was getting later in the year. It was October up there. We weren't at the first snow, but it was 30-degree nights overnight. It was pretty cool. But there's a lot of tree cover there. There's evergreens. There's Douglas firs up there. It is almost impossible to penetrate that kind of tree cover with a thermal drone, even as apt and capable as the one that Todd has is. And it was amazing to me because I've done entire shows about that with people and had debates about whether or not thermal drones may be the answer, or at least part of the answer to doing some of the research. And I still think they play a part, because if we were in an area, and we did this a couple of times, we found some deer that we were able to drill down on. We saw a heat signature. Hey, there's a heat signature. Let's get above it. Let's turn the IR off, the thermal part of the drone off, and just go to the HD camera. And we were able to zoom in. And had it been a Sasquatch laying there, we would have been golden. We would have had some really, really good video evidence of a Sasquatch. So it is possible, but it's not probable. I mean, I think his battery lasts for 30 minutes or so. I mean, and you can't cover a lot of area in 30 minutes, even as much as people would think you could with a thermal drone. It's labor intensive. Todd's probably got 150, 200 hours of training just to be able to be as proficient as he is with his drone. And he's never caught an image of a Sasquatch using a drone in that area where I believe Sasquatch are probably hanging out. So it's definitely not the end all be all. I think it's something that people should use. I encourage it. I know people who are buying drones. I know when I was on Russ's show as a guest, Brad, his co-host, was waiting on his drone to come in because he had just purchased a thermal drone. And he was excited to get it out in the woods. I think that's great. I just don't think people should put a lot of stock in it being the only way or the best way to capture evidence or video of a Sasquatch. I just don't think it's going to happen that way.